Hello everybody, Ali from Spiffy Handhelds here. Today we're going to be looking at the Powkiddy Q90. The Powkiddy Q90 is a small form factor handheld that was released earlier in 2020. Originally launched at $50, the Powkiddy Q90 can now be had for around $25 to $35 on Aliexpress, making it one of the lowest cost options on the market from a well-known brand. Now, Powkiddy's reputation can be a little spotty with some sleeper hits and a lot of misses. So in this video, we'll see how this fares amongst the ranks. Today, we'll be looking to see if this holds up in 2023. Now, let's dive into a quick overview. On first glance, you'll notice that the Powkiddy Q90 closely resembles the Odroid Advance. We have a D-pad on the top and joystick on the bottom setup, 2 triggers, a start and select button, and 2 function buttons. You'll notice that the face buttons as well do not have any printing on the actual buttons themselves, but rather a small, subtle printing on the shell. The D-pad, face buttons, start and select buttons all feature rubber membranes. The trigger buttons and the function buttons all use micro switches. These are relatively quiet. The face buttons themselves are also relatively quiet. Flipping the Q90 onto its side, we'll see a power switch, and on the other side, an analog volume control, similar to a Game Boy Advance. At the bottom, we'll find a single SD card slot, which is going to be utilized for our ROM set and operating system of our choice, a headphone jack, and flipping to the top, we'll notice a USB-C connection. This is only used for charging. Now at this point, if you're like me, you'd be wondering, where the heck are the speakers? Let's flip over to the back. We're going to find 2 stereo speakers. This speaker placement is very interesting, and it's a point we'll talk about later. Additionally, behind this battery door, we're going to find a standard Nokia style battery. These batteries are plentiful and can be purchased at very low prices. That's a nice thing the Q90 has going for it, the ease of replaceability of batteries like this. Let's go over some brief specs. The Q90 is by no means a powerhouse. It features the all-winner F1C100S, which is commonly found in the Famiclone space. Let's also take note that this SoC does not feature GPU, so we're not going to get any kind of shader capability. With regards to the battery, Powkiddy claims that this 1500 mAh battery can provide about 4 to 6 hours of battery life. Now, to achieve acceptable performance on some of these emulators, we are going to need to overclock the CPU, so this will likely reduce our battery expectancy. Without further ado, let's get this thing turned on. You'll see a green light indicator showing that the device is now powered on. I'm running a custom firmware on my unit by the name of Miu CFW, which was also designed for other handhelds like the BitBoy, the Powkiddy Q90's vertical brother, the V90, and the Q20. Let me know in the comments if you'd like a video on how to set this custom firmware up, and set up other things like the emulator and overclocking for each emulator. Now that we're all booted up, let's talk about the screen. This device features a 3-inch IPS screen. Aspect ratio is going to be 4:3. Our resolution is 320 by 240, so a little lower than usual, but let's not forget this is also half an inch smaller than usual diagonal, so this will come in at a higher PPI. The bezels around the screen are unfortunately a little chunky, but it's not the end of the world. At this price point, this screen is honestly not quite bad. Colors are good, contrast is good, and it does get surprisingly bright. The viewing angles are not terrible either. Let's talk about the material over the screen here for a second. This is a plastic lens cover, similar to something like a PSP or a Game Boy Advance. We've come to get used to the glass coating on a lot of these retro handhelds, which provide good scratch resistance, a nice overall finish, and not having to be concerned about putting it in your pocket. This, however, does feel a little cheap. This will likely eventually develop a fair amount of scratches, but time will have to tell. This might be a little frustrating, but let's not forget that this is a low-cost handheld, and some savings have to be made somewhere. Now, on that note of cost savings, let's take a step back here and look at the overall build of this handheld. This feels surprisingly premium in your hands. Looking at this, it's a little inconspicuous. It is a little plasticky looking, but it's actually firm in the hands. It feels like it could take a couple drops. This is really not too bad in terms of build quality. The one gripe that I have here, however, is this awful analog slider. This thing is just awful. It doesn't feel accurate, it doesn't feel comfortable to use, and probably the most biggest offender of all is the fact that this little nub kind of just floats around freely and I can spin it around. So you're losing a lot of traction when you're using this. I would just skip using this altogether. There is a fair amount of device rattle too, which is unfortunate. It's something that bothers me personally, but to some others it might not be that big of a deal. But at its core, this is a fairly competent handheld in terms of feel. The D-pad actually feels quite excellent. The buttons themselves all feel really good. The triggers, like I mentioned earlier, are silent and tactile. This thing is not too bad in terms of comfort at all. Ergonomics are also pretty impressive for a device of this size. And on that note of size, this is a very low profile device. It's pretty thin, it's not too wide. This fits in your pocket really nicely, and I find myself just forgetting that it's in my pocket because of how light it is and how slim profile it is. Now, before we get into some actual game testing, let's get a quick sound test out of the way. Now, remember how I mentioned we would talk about the speaker placement? Well, depending on how you have this device set up, it either can sound fantastic or quite poor. The speakers are on the back, so if we have it laying down, or if we're covering the speakers with the way we're holding it, it's going to sound muffled and trapped inside the device. However, if we hold it in a fashion where we kind of cup the sound and point it towards us, the acoustic stage is really not too bad at all. Now, with a lot of the Super Nintendo library, unfortunately the Powkiddy Q90 is just not going to cut it. As you can see in the footage, we're seeing a lot of frame rate drops and frame skipping. If you're playing a simple game, something like Dr. Mario as pictured earlier, this is not going to be too much of a problem, or a simple RPG. However, once we start getting into some of these harder to run games, we're going to see some issues. Bear in mind, we have overclocked the Q90 to a 798 MHz rate for all these tests. So even with overclocking, we're still experiencing some issues. In some cases, fully turning the sound off or dropping the sound quality rate did improve performance or sometimes flat out completely fix performance. However, this is a pretty big compromise to make, and not something everyone would be comfortable making. We're going to see a similar kind of story when we move on to the PS1. Now, let's talk about who this device is for, and how it stacks up against the competition right now. If you're on a budget and are looking to play systems up to the GBA with 40 to 50% or more of the PS1 SNES library in something that can easily fit in your pocket, this may be the device for you. However, this isn't a device that is very plug and play. You will need to do some degree of setup to get things running more smoothly than they would with the stock firmware and settings. So I cannot in confidence recommend this as an entry-level device. The price point really does do this device a lot of favors, however. At $25 to $35 with a relatively sturdy build, I can throw this into my pocket with my keys and not be stressed about fragility or damage with something like a Mio Mini. The quality of the screen, buttons, and speakers is really quite surprising at this price point as well. If you aren't a fan of vertical handhelds, the V90 is an identical device in a GBSP reminiscent form factor. Now, if you had some extra play in your budget, I would personally spring for something more like the RG35XX or the Mio Plus, or even a second-hand Retroid Pocket 2 Plus if you're looking for something in a horizontal layout, which will all emulate PS1 and SNES almost perfectly for an additional $20 to $30, with some extra goodies. Some of these devices can do NDS, some of them can even do Dreamcast, 64, and more. In conclusion, I believe the Q90 is a solid, cost-effective, and very usable budget handheld in a fun form factor. Thanks for checking this review out, and come back for more handheld content.